Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Margaret M. Mitchell. I'm the Dean of the Divinity School and Professor of New Testament and Early Christian Literature. On behalf of the faculty of the Divinity School, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2013 John Nuveen Lecture. I do want to begin with just a brief facilities apology. We're in the process of remodeling this room, including new lighting, and at the moment it's really dark in here, and I just want to acknowledge that that's not the ultimate plan, but the challenge to you is keep your eyes on the speaker. The John Nuveen Lecture was established in 1972 by the Baptist Theological Union, which is meeting here today under the leadership of its president, Reverend Dr. Larry Greenfield, in order to provide the lecture an annual occasion at which a distinguished member of the faculty of the University of Chicago provides a lecture at the Divinity School on some aspect of her or his current research. John Nuveen was one of Chicago's most important and influential business and civic leaders. He had deep ties to the University of Chicago, and he served as a trustee of the Baptist Theological Union. The BTU is a most valued partner to the Divinity School's mission of excellence in the academic study of religion. May I ask that BTU members present please stand to be recognized, and thanks for your work. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Daniel Sulmasy, Kilbride Clinton Professor of Medicine and Ethics in the Department of Medicine and the Divinity School at the University of Chicago, Associate Director of the McLean Center for Clinical Medical Ethics in the Department of Medicine. Dr. Sulmasy holds the MD degree from Cornell University and a PhD from Georgetown University. He is the author of 4 books: The Healer's Calling, 1997, Methods in Medical Ethics, 2001, second edition, 2010, The Rebirth of the Clinic, 2006, and A Balm for Gilead, 2006. He also serves as editor-in-chief of the journal Theoretical Medicine and Bioethics, and he serves on the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Problems that was called by President Obama in April of 2010, and the November 2012 meeting of that commission was held right here in Swift Hall, thanks to Dr. Sulmasy. The title of Dr. Sulmasy's lecture today is Medicine as a Spiritual Discipline, Lessons from Fred. We're all eager to know about this Fred. Dr. Sulmasy's lecture is taken from his forthcoming book, Sacramentum Medicinae, Healing in Faith, Hope, and Love, which is a series of meditations on the 3 theological virtues and their application to medical care. He will discuss his relationship with one particular patient and what that patient taught him about the spiritual life in and through the practice of medicine. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Daniel Sulmasy.
Well, thanks, Margie, for the very gracious introduction, the invitation to give the lecture. My thanks also to the sponsors of the Nuveen lecture, the Baptist Theological Union. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I guess usually this lecture is given by outsiders to the Divinity School, and I'm sort of amphibious. I'm an insider and an outsider with a joint appointment. But one of the great joys I've had over the last few years since I've been here is working with my colleague Fark Curlin, as well as in the medical school, as well as my colleagues here in the Divinity School, to start a program on medicine and religion here at the University of Chicago. And if you'll allow me one little plug, we're having a national conference downtown March 7th to 9th. If any of you are interested, it's incoming. It's We had 250 people last year and 150 abstracts submitted. It's interfaith and interdisciplinary and is part of the kind of spirit that we're trying to cultivate for that program. So if you like something of what you hear today and you want more, maybe this would be a good thing to do. I start by suggesting something that should be of no surprise to you, but is often a surprise to a lot of my colleagues in medicine, that religion is about a lot more than ethics. And even though my degree is in ethics, and I do most of my work in medical ethics, this is not a talk about ethics. It's really more about the spirituality of practice. I think an important but neglected aspect of the overlap between medicine and religion. And in particular, it's going to be more about it from the perspective of the practicing healthcare professional, physicians, nurses, and others, rather than the perspective of patients. You know, if you go to the average bookstore, Barnes & Noble, to the extent that bookstores still exist, you know, you'll see rows and rows of books about the spirituality of dealing with various ailments and illnesses and dealing with death as a patient, but very little about the spiritual lives of the people who practice medicine, nursing, psychology, other healing arts. And particularly for my colleagues here who might know me more from my more analytic work in ethics, closely argued ethical explorations of questions in medicine, I don't know that that's the appropriate technique for the subject for tonight. And so I'm going to turn mostly to narrative. And at a school that analyzes texts, what I'm going to do is provide you with a text and then leave it to you to analyze it. It's going to be very particular, a true story, and out of my own experience, it's going to be inevitably Christian, Catholic, and Franciscan, not meant in any way to exclude, but I think to include the kind of particularity that's necessary to speak from an authentic enough space that there will be resonances, I hope, across people of all faiths and even of no faith. And the last maybe thing to say is that you'll hear in this incidents that refer to my life as a Franciscan friar. For those of you who aren't aware, I left the Franciscan order and married a year ago, and just in case, either before the lecture or in a few moments afterwards, you get to meet my lovely wife, Lois, and you're confused by the story's references to Franciscan friars. That's just a bit of personal history. But with all that, for the next 40 minutes or so, I'm just going to tell you a story. In the end, I would fail him. It was as inevitable as the rain. I knew it from the beginning. See, I was the ethicist on call for the second week of November. A nurse called me and said that a patient wanted help with an advanced directive. I waited till the end of the day, after first attending to a few emails and editing, and then trudged over to the hospital to the cardiac step-down unit. Not too many requests for living wills here, I thought to myself, knowing that cardiologists didn't actually believe their patients actually ever die of heart disease, only that they sometimes might succumb to comorbidities like diabetes, or else they just died when the code was called. And then in the latter case, it wasn't heart disease, but rather the failure of technology that did them in. In any event, it was just plain unusual to have a patient on a cardiac floor fill out an advance directive. Otherwise, a routine request I'm used. I would take a few minutes to explain the difference between a living will and a healthcare proxy, recommending that the patient execute a healthcare proxy and letting him know why. And then I'd leave him with some blank forms and be on my way. Usually, in our hospital, this sort of task is delegated to our patient representatives. Sometimes, however, patients insist that it must be the ethicist with whom they speak, and I'm happy to serve if that's the patient's request. In fact, I had done the same for a patient in the medical intensive care unit a week before. Not like a full-blown ethics consult with a dilemma or a disagreement or some other knotty problem. The request seemed routine enough that I didn't even bother to look at the patient's chart before I entered the room. "Mr. Fred Finnerty?" I inquired. He nodded his head. He looked a bit disheveled. He was obviously frightened. He was 64 years old, on the short side, a bit overweight, mostly bald, with a snow-white, untrimmed beard. The places where the razor should have cut his face back to the bare skin were peppered with a grisly white stubble. His voice was unpleasant to hear. A strong New York accent combined with a whiny lilt. "I know who you are," he said. "You're that Dr. Sulmasy. I met you after a lecture 6 months ago, you remember? We invited you to that talk at our chapter of the Sarah Club, that group that promotes vocations to the priesthood." I had only the vaguest recollection. "Oh, yes, I remember. Good to meet you again. I understand you want help filling out an advance directive." "I got lung cancer, No, I didn't. To be honest, I didn't even look at your chart." "Would you be my doctor?" Excuse me? "I heard you lecture, and I said to myself, if I'm ever really sick, I want that Sulmasy." He spoke so earnestly that his head leaned forward on his neck and his eyes seemed to strain forward out of his skull, each held in place by its optic nerve the way a leash holds a dog in place upon meeting another dog. But you have doctors caring for you, don't you?" "Yeah, but they're for my cancer and my atrial fibrillation. I want a regular doctor. I know I can't be cured. I need a doctor for when things get bad. And I don't want no feeding tubes or nothing. I'm a Catholic, but I don't want someone telling me I gotta have one. I trust you." Now, to be honest, this is one of the problems that accompanies the giving of public lectures. If you sound sincere, people believe you. They might even believe in you. And if they do, this forces you either to try to live up to their expectations or avoid getting involved. Sane people avoid such situations. Doctors, known for their outsized egos, climb right up onto the pedestal and pose. "Sure, I'll be your doctor. Now let me go back to the nursing station, read over your chart, come back and talk to you and examine you." That's how it began. He had metastatic non-small cell lung cancer. He had been diagnosed in September, and it was now November. He was receiving Tarceva, a relatively mild anti-cancer drug with some activity against lung cancer. He was also undergoing radiation treatment to a painful metastasis in his right shoulder. He was admitted with fever and cough, possible pneumonia. His blood was also very thin, a consequence of an interaction between the Tarceva and the medicine he was taking to prevent blood clots associated with atrial fibrillation, the disturbance in his heart rhythm. "I'm gay, he said as I was listening to his lungs. "And I'm an alcoholic, but I go to meetings. I've been sober 25 years, a friend of Bill's." "One day at a time," I said, somewhat awkwardly. "Yeah," he replied. "Now take a deep breath in while I examine your belly." "I know a lot of priests." "Oh, really? Where from? AA?" You can't ask me that." His heart had been beating too quickly when he was admitted. The cardiologists were giving him medications to slow his heart rate, but one of the side effects was to lower his blood pressure. He couldn't stand up without becoming dizzy. Complicating matters, he was having side effects from the Tarceva, a rash and diarrhea. And the diarrhea had caused him to lose large amounts of body fluid, making his blood pressure even lower. A couple of liters of normal saline intravenously did the trick. His blood pressure came up, His heart rate came down, and after a week in the hospital, he could go home. When I saw him in the office 5 days later, he was not doing very well. His blood pressure was still lower than I wanted it to be, and his heart rate was still too high. He was nauseated from the Tarceva and still having diarrhea. I tried to get him to take in more salt, soups, crackers, pretzels. "You've got to keep up your fluids," I urged him. He was also quite short of breath when he tried to walk. His oncologist thought it was his heart. I thought it was all the nodules of cancer in his lungs. The oncologist also thought that the Tarceva might be helping him. Having looked at Mr. Finnerty's x-rays, I found it hard to see how he could draw such a conclusion. I sometimes wonder who is more likely to be in denial, cancer patients or their oncologists. "Here's my healthcare proxy form," said Fred. "I named Father O'Malley. He's a good friend." "Thanks," I said, putting a copy in the chart. "If we need it, now we know who to call." "I want to go to St. Clair's Hospice when my time comes. I don't like that Mount Carmel. They were not very nice to this friend of mine. You see, he wanted to go out on passes and they wouldn't let him. They were like the nuns in my grammar school. So much attention to law and order, they lose sight of the big picture." "Okay, Mr. Finnerty, but I understand it takes a long time to get into St. Clair's. They're always running full and there's a waiting list." "I can wait. I do live alone, but I cashed in my life insurance and I could use my IRA. And I got aides coming to the house and can get them to come round the clock if I need them. The nurses come 2 days a week and the physical therapist 3 times. I think it would be easiest to stick with the home nursing service till a bed opens up. But if the list is long, why don't you just put me on it now?" Well, I said, let's wait and see what the oncologists say about the Tarceva. It may stabilize your disease and give you more time. We need to say you have 6 months or less to get you onto hospice. Actually, I believed he probably already was eligible for hospice. But this was the first patient I had cared for who was being treated with Tarceva. I couldn't challenge the oncologist with my limited knowledge and experience. And I didn't want to undermine the oncologist's message to his patient. Not only did I say what I did to keep the patient from a dispute among his doctors, but also because I was an interloper. The patient had brought me into his care right under the nose of his oncologist, and the oncologist might be worried that the ethicist was stealing the patient away from anti-neoplastic treatment into the world of palliation. So I decided to parrot the oncologist's line about needing to wait a few more weeks to do a CT PET scan to see if the Tarceva was working. 2 days later, he saw the oncologist, who immediately admitted him to the hospital. The nurse, the nausea and the vomiting about which he had complained to me had worsened. The patient had become dehydrated again and had nearly fainted. His blood pressure remained too low and his heart rate too high. The Tarceva was stopped and he received intravenous saline once more. The nausea dissipated and his blood pressure came up. We discharged him on a lower dose of Tarceva to see if he could tolerate it, but 2 weeks later, in the face of more nausea and diarrhea, it was clear he wasn't tolerating the drug at any dose. I decided he was now really too sick to see me in the office, so I'd start making house calls instead. "Will they give me IV treatment at St. Clair's?" "Well, Mr. Finnerty, they usually don't do that in hospice. As people get sicker, experience has shown that it's actually a bit better to be dry. We could just give people too much coughing if they get too much fluid." "Well, what about today? Can I have the IV today?" "Well, can't you just drink salty liquids like soup?" "Nothing staying down, Doc." "Well, you are still dehydrated." In fact, it was hard to tell how much the drop in his blood pressure upon rising from bed was due to deconditioning and how much from dehydration. He had, in my judgment, taken to bed much earlier than he needed to. He had, it seemed, many acquaintances, but it was hard to tell if he had any real friends. I gradually learned that he had been estranged from quite a few members of his family. One of his cousins, a priest, had accused him of murdering his mother by not authorizing the use of a feeding tube as she was dying of Alzheimer's. He stated that he was close to a few of his nephews, but it seems that this itself was a source of strain in his relationship with their parents. He was a frequent AA sponsor, and some of his fellow alcoholics visited him as well. So I guess we can give you some normal saline by vein. I'll check with the nursing agency. But this is no substitute for good old chicken soup. I want you to eat and keep up with your fluids. So began a twice-weekly ritual of normal saline infusions. Even when we had finally succeeded in controlling his nausea, he still kept insisting on the saline infusions. From a purely biomedical point of view, I think these infusions were superfluous. From another point of view, however, they were grossly inadequate. I simply came to regard them as a kind of placebo that seemed to help him. A week later, I received a call. "I think I'm dying, Doc." Okay, Mr. Finnerty, easy now. Tell me what's bothering you. "I got more pain in my shoulder, and I'm nauseous again, and my stomach hurts, and I ain't had a bowel movement in 3 days." Easy, Mr. Finnerty. Has the nurse been in today? "Not yet." "Are you taking that Senecot?" "No, I thought I could just get by with the Colace." "And what about the Tylenol number 3 for your pain?" "I don't want to. I'm an addict, you know." "Mr. Finnerty, I think we can take care of this. I'll order the pain meds. You're not going to get addicted, and you're not going to be a martyr. Listen to me. We'll give you an enema and some pain medicine and start you back on the Senecot. If you need to keep taking that ondansetron, we'll give that to you as well. And if that's not enough, I'll order a suppository for your nausea. It's going to be okay." "You mean I'm not dying?" "Well, certainly not today." "How do you know that?" "Well, because people who are dying usually aren't well enough to call their doctors on the phone to tell them that they're dying. Every problem you have is fixable." "When then?" "Well, not today." "What about Sinclair's?" "Well, you're number 2 on the list." "Hey, it's kind of morbid, Doc. Waiting for people to die." "Okay, I'll give them a call." "Can I have your beeper number? I mean, I won't abuse it or nothing. I just want to have it in case I can't get you otherwise." "Sure, Mr. Finnerty, sure." In total, I made 5 home visits. As much as I urged him to get up out of bed, I never found him anywhere else but in bed when I arrived. The apartment was well lived in and filled with statues and pictures of saints. He had a book for reciting the prayers of the Liturgy of the Hours, something usually only used by priest brothers and sisters at his bedside. His rosary beads were never far away. Usually they were wrapped around his right hand. He was blessed with an exceptional cadre of nurses and home attendants. The attendants kept trying to get him to roll over and lay on his side to prevent bed sores. He was not very compliant. They were all young Mexican women and at least as pious as he was. They also made great chicken soup. "I'm afraid I'm going to be damned," he said to me one day, his eyes again straining out of their sockets. "Well, you've received the sacrament of the sick and you've confessed, haven't you?" "Yeah, but I'm still afraid, Doc." "Mr. Finnerty, you need to believe in your heart what you profess with your lips. I believe God loves you. Don't you? I don't believe God wants you damned." What did this guy want from me? After all, I really didn't like him. He would not have been my first choice for a drinking buddy. I didn't like the sound of his voice. I especially didn't like his neediness. It was a really busy time for me with grant deadlines and writing assignments and speaking engagements, and every time I went away, I left complicated instructions for how he could reach me. In truth, he never once abused the privilege of having my beeper, but I had not given my beeper number to a patient in years, perhaps because none had been nervy enough, as Fred had, to ask for it. Nor was I in the regular habit of making home visits. Home visits are really not easy to work into a modern physician's schedule. I figured out that the simplest way for me to do so would be to do them first thing in the morning. I'd go to his apartment by subway on the way to work. That way the whole task could be accomplished in about 75 minutes, including the visit itself and the extra travel time needed to get back to my office at the hospital. I brought a medical student with me one day. She had never seen a doctor make a home visit. The visits to Mr. Finnerty's apartment were at least somewhat helpful medically, but I could easily have relied upon the nurses' assessments without ever visiting. They were really excellent nurses. They had extraordinary patience with him. When he demanded a special air-cushioned bed, and they tried to explain to him that his insurance company wouldn't pay for it because he didn't have any bed sores, his primary nurse, Tom, dutifully called me, explaining to Mr. Finnerty that he didn't think that the chair of the ethics department was going to lie to get his patient insurance coverage to pay for it. Each visit was difficult to conclude. Since I was on his turf, I couldn't rely on the rattling sound of the chart of the next patient being placed in the slot on the door as a convenient prompt for me to suggest that the visit must draw to a close. That only works when you're in the office. Mr. Finnerty especially loved talking with me about church gossip. Who would be the next Archbishop of New York? What did I think about bishops denying communion to Catholic politicians who supported abortion? Now, one of the times I was out of town during the time I was caring for him, it was to give a talk on spirituality and healthcare. And as part of this workshop, I asked the participating physicians to spend 10 minutes thinking about just one patient. It's a useful exercise for physicians. It's often extremely difficult for physicians to do this, to think about just one patient. In fact, studies have shown that even when the patient is present and starting to say what's wrong, physicians on average interrupt within 18 seconds. As a gesture of solidarity, when I ask my colleagues to do this, I participate in the exercise myself. And on this occasion, not surprisingly, it was Mr. Finnerty who occupied my meditation. Within a few moments, my meditation had turned into a litany. I could see his face, and I could hear his voice. And I prayed to myself, Lord, have mercy on Fred. Fred, have mercy on Fred. Lord, have mercy on Fred. Over and over. Although he was never exactly cheery, his mood gradually became much bluer. I began to think that in retrospect, perhaps even his reluctance to get out of bed had probably been a sign of depression that I'd been overlooking all along. Do you think you might be depressed? I asked. I think I am, he replied. Have you been depressed before? Yeah, when my lover died 25 years ago, I was really bad. They put me on some medicine. Do you remember what it was? It was too long ago, Dr. Sulmasy. Now, it's always been a puzzle to me how it is that so very many gay people reconcile themselves to the church and its teaching, live lives that often directly violate church teachings regarding homosexuality, and yet are so traditional and devotional in their religious practices. To inquire more deeply, though, would have been mere curiosity on my part and probably not helpful. Perhaps it would stir up too much that had long ago been deeply buried. Such a discussion might even now be harmful, I thought. Better to leave it among the mysteries that only God knows. I decided I wouldn't ask further. Don't ask, just serve. Probably as good a policy as there is for a physician. I simply prescribed an antidepressant. Now, since he lived alone and was fixed on the idea of going to an inpatient hospice, we never did apply for a hospice program. We had decided that the regular home care nursing program would be good enough as a bridge to hospice. And in fact, it was more than good enough. 11 weeks after stopping the Tarsiva and having immediately made the application to St. Clair's, he had still not been admitted to the hospice. Waiting times for inpatient hospices can be extraordinary in this country. Most of his best hospice time was spent playing that morbid game of waiting for other people to die. In fact, though, he had really excellent hospice care without the name. The home care nurses who attended him were wonderful. His aides, that cadre of young Latinas, were strong, joyful, delightful, and caring. He had very little pain through most of the course of his illness. He never did develop a bed sore despite his early trouble with diarrhea and the fact that he infrequently left the bed. He did lose weight. His appetite remained poor, but he could still read the papers, pray the rosary, and tell people what to do. In examining him one day, I noted that he remained free of jaundice, his lungs were clear, his liver was only slightly enlarged, but on that day I felt a new right supraclavicular node. And with my fingers lingering there for a few seconds to confirm the finding, he felt me feeling it. "What'd you find, Doc?" A lymph node, Mr. Finnerty." "That means I ain't got much time left, huh?" I don't know that it means that. I think it does mean that the cancer's growing, but you didn't need me to tell you that. "Does it mean it's going to go to my brain?" No, I don't think so. 2 weeks later, however, at the end of February, things suddenly did change. He began to complain of more pain in his shoulder and in his abdomen. Until this time, Tylenol number 3 had been sufficient. We now changed over to hydromorphone since he had some in his house. He called my office one morning and sounded a bit confused. The aides began to panic. I called his nurse Tom to see him and to let me know what he thought. He called me back and said, "I think he's dying, Dr. Sulmasy." "Well, maybe we need to start a morphine drip. He has a Heplock in place, so I can just hook him up." But it's Friday afternoon, of course. The home infusion team is going to be tough to mobilize. Can he still take pain medicine by mouth? "I don't know. Let me see," Tom replied. "Maybe if I crush the hydromorphone and put it in some pudding, I can get him to take it." He called a few minutes later to report that it had worked. Later, I spoke with the supervisor for the home nursing care team. "We need a plan for the weekend," she said. "I'm with you. I was just trying to sketch out a plan myself." You see, the home IV infusion team had confirmed that they would not be able to start an intravenous morphine drip until Monday. The home health aides were not legally authorized to give injections, so subcutaneous morphine was out. And the smallest fentanyl patch available was still too potent, given how little pain medicine he'd been requiring. And the supervisor had tried calling pharmacies, and none of them stocked morphine or hydromorphone in suppository form. "But I'm an old hospice nurse," she said, "and so is the nurse covering for Tom over the weekend. We'll just make our own suppository out of crushed pills if he can't take it by mouth." "A deal," I replied, "and I'm around all weekend. I'll keep my beeper on, and certainly, if the time comes, I'll be willing to sign the death certificate." I visited him for the last time that night. I needed a complex plan just to get to his apartment. See, I was scheduled to drive out to Long Island for an overnight day of recollection with my local friar community at a small retreat place. Further, I had promised a young friar who had just started chemotherapy for acute lymphoblastic leukemia at a nearby major cancer center that I would visit him that same night. I also realized that I'd left my cell phone home at the friary, and I wanted to have it with me while I was on retreat in case I was out walking and someone paged me about Fred. And, of course, they were predicting a big snowstorm. In the end, my plan was simple: to go steadily north before heading east. Accordingly, my first stop was Fred's apartment. I parked illegally to save time, hoping I wouldn't get caught. I didn't bring a stethoscope, I didn't bring a prescription pad. One of the young Mexican girls answered the door. "He just take the morphina," she said. "Good," I answered. He was lying in bed, as always, the rosary beads wrapped around his right hand. The, quote, New York State out-of-hospital do not resuscitate order, unquote, form was clipped to his bedboard. I had helped him to fill it out. I knew it was the correct thing to do, but now it seemed intrusive and awkward, almost a desecration. "Mr. Finnerty, it's Dr. Sulmasy. Are you doing okay? Are you comfortable?" He opened his mouth, but he didn't speak. He raised his head for a few seconds and opened his eyes. Then he closed them again as his head fell back gently against the pillow. He was breathing 20 times a minute. His pulse wasn't palpable at the wrist, but as I touched his abdomen to be sure he wasn't in pain, I could feel his abdominal aorta. It was beating forcefully. The rate was probably 120. I didn't bother to count. His right leg was bent at the knee, raised up off the bed and trembling. I touched his knee gently and eased it back down. The aide positioned the pillow under his left leg so that his right ankle would rest upon it as well. "Easy, Fred. I think you'll feel better this way." And a mild look of strain disappeared from his face, melting into the peace of the morphina. And I held his hand and prayed. "Time for night prayer, Fred. Protect us, Lord, as we stay awake. Watch over us as we sleep. That awake we may keep watch with Christ, and asleep rest in his peace. Lord, now you let your servant go in peace in accordance with your word. For my own eyes have seen the salvation which you have promised in the sight of every people, a light to reveal you to the nations, the glory of your people Israel. May the all-powerful Lord grant us a restful night and a peaceful death. Good night, Fred." I turned to a young man who had been sitting silently in a chair in one corner of the room. His bare arms were heavily tattooed. One of those nephews, perhaps? Or an alcoholic he had sponsored at AA? I wasn't sure. "It's good that you're here. Stay with him." And I left the apartment. Within a few moments, I found myself driving up to the cancer center to visit that young friar, John, who had recently started chemotherapy for leukemia. As the headlights rolled past on the opposite side of the highway, I felt as if someone else was doing the driving. I was merely going along for the ride. I headed north in the darkness, vaguely conscious of the river to my right, vaguely conscious of my visit to Fred behind me. Yet I couldn't avoid asking myself a new question. Why John? Or rather, I was asking God, why all the young, good, energetic, healthy friars? The shift from Fred to John felt like a film editor's splicing mistake. The scene had changed, but the scene was from another movie, and I was playing this odd supporting role in both scenes. You see, another good, young, energetic friar of our province had recently been diagnosed with multiple myeloma. We were barely past the pain of that diagnosis when we learned that John had leukemia. Don't you realize how strapped we are for vocations, how we're pulling out of commitments to parishes and other places because we don't have enough friars? And then I caught myself, so much for my theological sophistication. In the end, these sorts of questions can't be explained by ratiocinations. I think they come from the lung, not the cerebral cortex. I wondered how John would really do. His prognosis was not very good. I wondered whether the time would come when my visits to John would become like my visits to Fred, the alpha and the omega of cancer treatment, all within a 90-minute span. Was this the avant-garde movie I seemed to be living? And as I continued driving up the highway towards the cancer center, I also remembered that I needed to go to the Friary to pick up my cell phone, and I was fearful I might forget and just drive out to Long Island, so even before the cancer center, I was reminding myself to remember. After all, I was still planning to take my usual walk along the beach the following morning. I'd carry my beeper, but I would also need my phone. They might call about Fred while I was out walking and praying, and the best thing to do would be to be prepared, because it could happen at any time. Well, my geographic plan seemed to work. I visited John, I drove to the Friary, picked up the phone, and then drove out to Long Island to the retreat place at the beach. And I had beaten the coming snowstorm. Very efficient, just like a dock. One of the friars with whom I lived had gone to the retreat house earlier in the day. He had prepared a late dinner for the two of us. It was a Friday in Lent, so we ate fish, sole stuffed with crab meat, hardly penitential. We had a nice dinner. I said nothing about Fred and barely mentioned that I had seen John and just said that he was doing okay. We had a lively conversation that I found pleasantly distracting. Before we knew it, it was after 11, so I washed the dishes, picked out one of the guest rooms, and prepared to go to bed. The snowstorm that had been predicted by the weather forecast never did arrive. In its place began a torrential, windswept rain blown in off the ocean, beating with a rhythmic tapping against the northeast window of my room. No snow, no sleet, no winter lightning, just the rain. I charged my cell phone, placed my beeper on the nightstand next to the bed. I was waiting for that call. It might come very well during the night. I would instruct the nurses and the family, bring a note of calm, and finally bring Fred's story to a close. Whatever he wanted from me, he seemed to want me to be with him to the end of his journey, and I was determined to see it through. I didn't use a prayer book that night. I was tired, so I prayed the Canticle of Simeon to myself once more, this time from memory. Night prayer again, this time for me. And I fell asleep. I awoke the next morning at 6:30 in the grayness of a cloudy sunrise, before the alarm, and I was seized with a sudden sense of panic. The rain was much softer, but it hadn't stopped. I never changed the beeper signal from vibrate to alarm, I thought to myself. What if it went off and I didn't hear it? I fumbled for my glasses and pressed the message button on the beeper. Urgent, 3:42 a.m. EST, it said. I pressed it again. Urgent, 3:35 a.m. EST. Shit. I shook the fogginess out of my head, rubbed the sleep from my eyes, reached for the phone, and dialed the callback number. A woman answered with a voice so cheerful that it jarred me. I began to mumble, "I suspect you're the nurse who was covering for Mr. Finnerty over the weekend. I'm really sorry. I just woke up and I realized that you'd paged me in the middle of the night. I'm really sorry. I had the beeper on the nightstand next to the bed, but I forgot to turn it from vibrate to alarm. I said I'd be available day or night. I'm sorry." "No problem," she said, and it dawned on me that her cheeriness meant she'd been up all night and hadn't yet gone to bed herself. I got through to the covering internist, Dr. Weinstein, and he took care of everything. He was very pleasant and cooperative. "I want you to know that Mr. Finnerty's death was very peaceful. Family and friends were there with him. It all went smoothly. Now the funeral parlor is going to call you on Monday to sign the death certificate." "Oh, at least that's good to hear. Thanks so much. Again, I'm sorry." "Not a problem. It was a pleasure to care for him. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to bed." The showers were now alternating with hints of sun. I looked out the window and I saw a small patch of blue amid the lessening gray. I knew that the rain would eventually stop, and I would be able to get to the beach for my walk after all. The weather cleared, and I did make it to the beach. And I walked along the ocean for miles. The salt air and the sound of the waves seemed just right. But as I walked, I could not stop thinking about Fred. Every once in a while, I stopped walking, turned away from the beach, and looked out over the wide, storm-stirred ocean, seemingly endless in its expanse. Myriads of sunbeams were striking on the surface and dancing an angelic, brilliant ballet. At such times, the ocean can seem infinite. And yet I knew that it was not infinite. I could see the horizon. And horizons enclose us in the finite. Even this massive ocean, I thought, even this Atlantic Ocean was finite. Fred had demanded salt and water. But even the depths of this ocean would not have supplied enough saline for Fred. If we could have infused all of the saline of all of the oceans, of all of the world into his veins, it would not have been enough. I guess it may not be enough for any of us. I prayed that Fred's needs were now fulfilled, that all the neediness I saw in him, and I knew that I couldn't fulfill, had now been fulfilled. I began to thank Fred now for all he had taught me about my own needs and about my own insufficiency. I sensed, too, that I was somehow not alone. When I looked around, I couldn't see a soul, but I had this sense that I wasn't alone. Not now in my walking, not then whenever I visited Fred, or had seen him in my office or the hospital. Had Fred ever seen who was with me? I wasn't sure. But I finally realized as I walked along the beach and prayed that it had not been me that Fred had been looking for all along. Not ever. Never. Because each time he had asked me for something, or had asked anyone who cared for him for anything, a sleeping pill, a hospital bed, an enema, another infusion of saline, he was really looking for someone else. Had he noticed? I knew that I hadn't noticed, at least not until that moment. See, I had thought all along that Fred was looking for me with his pleading eyes and his plaintive voice. And I had quietly resented his calls because I knew that I could not meet his needs. But I saw it all differently then, at least at that moment, walking on the beach after the rain. The beach had been deserted all morning. It was cold and windy. The rain had only just stopped. But as I walked further down the wet sand, I finally did see someone else, another crazy person who had sought out the solace of the beach in winter. Far up ahead, standing by a fire at the edge of the foamy waves, I saw someone. The image was indistinct, but he was warming his hands over a fire. I wondered if Fred could see him any better than I could. The vision of the dead is sharper than the vision of the living, or so they say. As I drew closer, I could make out his wading boots and his tackle. A surf caster, I thought, as I watched him toss his line into the sea. Smart guy. First on the beach. The fish are always more abundant after the rain. Did Fred see him too? I hoped that he did. I smiled, looked at my watch, and realized it was getting late. I turned around and headed back down the beach to the retreat house. the friars would be expecting me for midday prayers.
So, Dr. Sulmasy invited the conversation, and you want to just field your own comments or questions?
Sure. Maybe not what anybody was expecting here today, but I'm perfectly happy to entertain comments, questions, your own reflections. Yes.
I'm interested in your forthcoming book. Is there a publication date and who is your publisher?
It's likely going to be Georgetown Press, but I'm talking to a few other folks. And what was the other?
Publication date?
Not established yet. This will be one of the chapters. Three on faith, 3 on hope, 3 on love. And they're not all narrative. Yes.
If I may, this is a little long point of information, but somehow seems important. A patient can simply request another doctor. My primary care physician seemed not to be allowed anywhere near me.
Yes, the question from people who can hear to the back is, shocked as a point of information that a patient can request another physician. The answer is yes, absolutely. There may be some kinds of restrictions according to your health care insurance plan. There may be some kinds of HMOs in which you would only have a separate a cadre of physicians from which you could choose. But you can always, even within an HMO, which is very strict, choose another physician. That's your right as a patient, and I defend that to the hilt. So.
Of course, I agree, but I mean, I couldn't get my primary care physician. I cannot imagine that the insurance says, no, you can't see your primary care physician if you're not, or you know better.
No, you can change. In this case, the patient was being seen by a specialist, and he wanted to change his primary care physician, and he did. And most patients are perfectly capable of doing it.
Well, last one, I wanted the primary care physician that I had seen for years. I'm sorry.
You want?
I wanted not to change anything. I just wanted to see the primary care physician that I've been with for years.
Yes. Now, so again, those restrictions would not be placed by anything other than insurance strictures. If somebody said that that person was no longer taking your insurance, that would be the restriction in that sense. But there's no way in which you should be legally prevented from changing physicians, or morally prevented from changing physicians.
Maybe I'll talk to you a little.
Okay, well, sure. Yes.
Could you say something about how, obviously this is a very powerful story for lots of obvious reasons. How has it impacted your care since then? Is there can you describe more of that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think it's about the kind of sense of humility in some ways, and recognizing the limits of the craft of medicine, and recognizing my limits as a practitioner, and the sense, deepening my sense that the need that medicine, part of the paradoxes of medicine is that the need that it addresses, the need for healing, is in some ways infinite. Right? But medicine is a finite craft practiced by finite practitioners. And coming to better terms with that has helped me in some ways to recognize that in some ways my insufficiency is sufficient, right? That I don't have to feel guilty when I can't meet the needs of these patients. I don't have to resent their asking for things, because patients who are demanding are not uncommon. And in the end, as Paul Ramsey once once quipped, the function of medicine is not to relieve the human condition of the human condition. And the more we as practitioners understand that, I think the better off we are. Yes?
A couple of times during the presentation, I was thinking of Sherwin Newland's How We Die. And it's commented in another piece of writing about the transition from the practice that he had, which was tactile. Here's where I thought about it. When you touched his knee, that wasn't an act of medicine, it was an act of comfort, compassion, and so on. And Newland says, I'm glad I'm not a physician in the future. That depends on studies of masses of people, of computer readouts, and so on. So I guess the question is the future of practice of medicine, and how close could we come to a recurrence of this kind of medical care, given what's now increasingly normative about medical care?
Just to some extent, your question is part of the question that I raised and try to address in the book, The Rebirth of the Clinic. Because I think in some ways we've hit bottom as a healthcare profession. And it's emblematic of this is a patient who related to me that she saw her physician, and what he was doing was, so Mrs. Smith, how are you feeling today? While typing the electronic medical record, and the body language is just so alienating that it's horrific for patients, but I think increasingly becoming horrific for physicians as well, who I think long for that connection, long for the touch, and they're not. There's nothing logical that says you can't practice excellent, 21st century high-tech medicine, and also touch patients, relate to them as whole persons, care for them as one struggling human being caring for another, and I think that's part of the sort of growing movement in medicine and religion that I'm happy to be part of, and I think our program in medicine and religion is part of here at the University of Chicago. Is trying to sort of bring the two together. And I think it's possible.
Confessing in my ministry, how often the touch is in its own way spiritual.
Yes, absolutely. I can tell you more stories, but I'll entertain more questions here. Yes, we're back.
So I have a practical question, maybe a different bent. I've just come from trying to convince a room of 18-year-olds, most of whom are pre-med or math majors in the making, that the humanities class they're taking with me is an important class. And we actually had that very conversation at the end, and one of them, who's really very lovely, said, "Well, you're our humanities teacher, you would think that." In essence. And so, I have no doubt that they would have more respect for you, even if you are religious, which is unfortunate because, as we now know in this age, religion is fertility, which is another thing that actually got said. But it would be really helpful for me to hear you enlarge on why it is that you chose to give a lecture in narrative form, what it was that you wanted to tell us and that you felt like you could tell us in this medium that wasn't going to come through in other ways.
Yeah, I think that, for instance, the couple of other times I've told this story, including last week at Emory, part of what was a wonderful experience for me is hearing other people's interpretation of my own experience as narrated. So I think that's been valuable. Second, to say that I learned, abstractly about the sufficiency of my own insufficiency doesn't tell everything that I think the narrative tells. So I think it's bigger than that. Third, I I sort of wrote this within a few hours after the beach, you know, because there was no other way I thought I could actually capture what had happened except to write it down and sort of pull those details together. And that the very thickness of it, in terms of the detail, is part of its, you know, part of its meaning. You know, to sort of remember incidents like the touching, and to tell that as a story, I think says more than to say to a room full of people, you know, we want to be touching patients more, because I think that the sort of living flesh and spirit of the story carries more meaning and a depth of meaning that the simple sort of description would not be able to capture. So those are maybe some of the reasons why I chose to do the narrative.
You mentioned more than once what you did not care for about this patient, and if we do that in casual conversation, it can be analyzed by a therapist. But you're a storyteller, and you included those details for a reason. Can you talk a little bit about why you wanted us to understand that you did not care for the sound of his voice and those sorts of things?
Well, yes, I think it's again to sort of try to be honest, and that gets us further than hiding those sorts of things. To be honest, because practitioners will often try not to be honest about the negative feelings that they have sometimes with patients, and I presume that pastors can often have toward their congregants as well. I mean, it's a common human experience, and that to try to deny those things, I think, is to do a disservice to the very reality with which we're struggling, and to be anything less than honest will wind up with a less than honest spirituality about these sorts of questions. So, I think that's part of the story. Is like, I kind of didn't like this guy, and there are other patients I don't like, and yet I'm in a position of service to this person. And you might even say that by the end of the story, at least by the time he died, I had come to love him, even if I don't like him, and to sort of recognize that for myself as well. Yes.
Is the story will be part of the chapters of love and faith going forward?
The question is, you're going to hear which section it will be. Well, I'm putting it in faith, actually, in the beginning. Yes. So, although obviously there's interconnection between all virtues, including theological virtues, and it's sort of hard. I've looked at that as I've sort of assigned these chapters to various parts of the book. They're all in some ways interconnected, and that's people in ethical theory and virtue theory would say that's true of all virtues, not just theological ones, cardinal virtues, etc. Yes.
This may be asking more than you can tell me, but I'm a little bit curious. Why Fred? Why did this particular patient move you in this particular way? Since, as you said, he was a needy patient, but needy patients are not uncommon. You didn't particularly like him. I'm wondering if there was some feature of your interaction with him that brought you to this.
I don't know that there was any one feature, and maybe this is sort of another answer to the question of why the narrative form. It was partly to help try to figure that out for myself that led me to write it, because I'm not. I don't think there was any one particular feature. It was just sort of, another person who's commented on this is Henry Richardson in the philosophy department at Georgetown, who's written a book that he calls Moral Entanglements, which I think is an unfortunate title, because it sounds like entanglements are bad, but his suggestion is more that missing from a lot of ethical theory is the way in which ethical obligations grow out of relationships that occur in this kind of historical narrative sequence, right? And that what I owe to people in the abstract is not what I owe to Fred, and what I owe to Fred is part of what unfolds as I am Fred's physician. And why it is that he struck me the way he did, why it is that sort of everything came pouring out, walking on the beach the way it did, I can't answer it any other way except to tell the story, which is, again, part of why I chose the narrative method. This is sort of like, I think, when T.S. Eliot was asked what, no, it was I'm sorry, James Joyce asked what Finnegan's Wake meant. He just started rereading it, so. I'm sorry. Yes, Margie, you had a question. Yes, don't neglect the dean until
no, thank you. My question connects with Mandy's a bit, and that is that I want to talk about the beginning a little bit. That you began by saying, in the end, I failed him. It was as inevitable as the rain. And it's obviously an inclusio with the ending in various ways. But was that the initial impulse to write? And is that the same way you see it now from these years' distance? Or do you, have you moved in some sense in terms of your model of the physician and some things you said after that about Paul Ramsey's statement about, what is the success of a physician? So talk a bit about failure and about what you as a physician should expect of yourself.
Sure. Well, obviously the first words of a narrative are often important, and those were chosen with some care, and it's the actual words are, in the end, I would fail him. And so it's sort of partly it's a foreshadowing, and in a sense, I mean this at 3 levels. Actually, there's a literal level of the story in which I fail him, and that I'm not able to answer the beeper because as I had promised to, and so I'm not able to meet his needs as I had promised to, etc. So I think there's a literal sense in which that's true. There is another a sense that we've talked about here in which it is absolutely not true. It's meant to be ironic in that sense, and that my insufficiency is sufficient. But then at the third level, the way I understand that my insufficiency is sufficient is by understanding the metaphysical necessity that I will fail all of my patients at this different level. So that's why I said it the way I did at the very beginning. And again, it's much easier to say one small sentence than it is to say all of that in terms of trying to interpret it. But that's, again, it's part of the reason for the narrative form.
Can I just follow up with a brief thing? Why is the first a failure, the fact that you didn't answer the beeper? What would you have done that would have been different?
Well, there's a sense, again, in which, again, this is part of what we want to do. Now, would he have noticed? He was probably comatose at that point, wouldn't. But it's the kind of commitment a physician makes to a patient, right? So I've committed myself to the good of this patient, and I, in fact, made a promise to him and to the nurses that I would see it through to the end, and that part of that was being available to sort of help orchestrate the care at the end, which required a physician, and it needed to have one of my colleagues, who was covering for me, do it. So that's that's the sense, the literal sense. Was that failure such a big failure by the end of the story? No. I think once you realize, again, part of the sort of psychoanalyzing myself through this and hearing other people interpreting the story. Somebody else told me, again at Emory, last week that she thought that actually the moment I left the apartment was over in terms of my freedom of responsibility for him. And in fact, this was probably subconsciously exactly what I was doing, because I was already free. I had already let go of him, and that maybe at some subconscious level I may not have turned the switch as I had intended, because I had already let go. Maybe that's also true. John?
What's the connection between this treatment is the title of your talk is part of medicine and spiritual discipline. What's the connection between this case and the spiritual discipline of medicine in the everyday?
Well, again, it's the question, if you didn't hear it on this side of the room, is the connection between spiritual and the everyday in this case, and that's part of the sort of learning the sufficiency of my insufficiency in terms of medicine for everybody. It's not just with Fred. I think it's also cultivating a spirit of humility about my practice and that of the whole craft. It's learning to reflect on our experience of patience. I'm often struck by the way in which the psalm says, if the Lord had not been on our side, this is Israel's song, if the Lord had not been on our side, then when the waters have come down. As I'm told, I don't know Hebrew, but I'm told that there's no past perfect conditional in Hebrew, and it's rendered that way in English, but it's this sort of sense that it is by sort of active reflection on our experience that we understand the divine in our everyday experience. And so part of this is also collective exercise in that. And then in another sense, for those of you who do training of divinity students, you can look at this as one, in particular for CPE, you can look at this as one long verbatim, right? Of my experience with a patient, and to be open to the sort of sense of looking for, improving my care through reflecting on these and finding the experience of the sacred in that work. I want to make sure there's not another person before I go to a second one. But, okay, yes.
I wonder, your story revealed that you spent an enormous amount of your own commitment and strength. How many times is that repeated?
Yes.
This is a question that we have also as teachers and ministers.
Yes.
And so on.
Yes.
How do you deal with that problem that our facility of our sensibilities are limited at that point?
Yes.
And cannot be extended.
Terrific question. Yes. If everybody, if my relationship with all my patients were like Fred, or all my patients were Fred, I'd be burned out and spent very quickly. And so, again, there are questions of real judgment that are necessary about what's the point at which, how many patients like this can a physician have in his or her practice. I think is a real question, and one has to sort of establish limits, I think, on that. There are other very needy patients with what's called a somatization disorder, patients who have was previously called hypochondriasis, or patients who have continuous calls because of symptoms that have psychological but not organic explanations, can be extremely draining on physicians. There's a limit to how many one can take in a practice. So part of it is a sense of what one's own capabilities and limits are, and judgment, so that the time one spends with one patient or a student or a member of a congregation can't take so much time that it takes away injustice from what one can give to others. And then second, sort of try as best we can to work in a collaborative way with others, so we can share some of that burden, so that in a group practice of physicians, it shouldn't be, as is sometimes the case, he's the religious one, he's got more patients than the rest of us have, supposedly, which is not true, we all know. Let's give him all the difficult patients, and that's not, that's not fair either. So we've got to learn to distribute and pitch in with our colleagues and recognize, again, this is part of recognizing our limits and how much we can do. And so it always requires judgment. And one can err on the side of being too stingy in terms of how much one gives, or one can err on the side of being burning out by trying to give more than one actually is capable of giving. Prudence is the phronesis is the virtue that helps us to make those kinds of judgments. Thanks.
I'm curious about it. You use the word needy and difficult to describe this patient who's popping out eyes. I loved your description of how much he wanted to engage you. Did you understand? Did you experience this as a reciprocal relationship? Did you receive something from that?
Yeah, that's another terrific question. I think through most of the relationship, I'd have to say that I thought it was all one way, and that's part of what I've also learned by the reflection on the experience, and that's part of why it was so difficult, is that I thought this is one way, all I'm doing is giving to Fred, is never enough, right? And it's more than I'm doing for any other patient, it's still not enough. And it was only later that I, in some ways, through the reflection and through the act of writing it, realized how much he had been giving to me all along. I hadn't been aware. So.
What did he give to you?
I'm sorry?
What did he give to you all along?
Well, I think he was giving me these sorts of lessons about what it means to be a physician, what it means to be humble as a physician, what it means to recognize my own limits, to be grateful for my ability to be as generous as I was, and be happy with that. I'm sure in some ways, he maybe all along, in a sort of providential sense, he knew he was giving me a story to tell other people, and I've been able to tell that through the experience, and it could never have happened but for Fred. He gave it. One last, okay.
You just, a number of points of crisis, you revert to ritual language. And that's a religious prayers that you. Is there an equivalent for medicine in the spiritual dimensions of medicine? Is there a ritual that serves that kind of purpose when human words or the words of our own extemporaneous words don't come?
Yeah, there's a lot, and there's a fair amount that's been written on this sort of quasi-liturgical sort of aspects of medicine, some of it having to do with touch. If you really observe carefully what goes on in an operating room, I mean, the surgeons all stand around like this, with their hands folded together so they don't touch anything. There's a ritual of washing before it occurs. I mean, there's a lot that's at least a kind of ritual. I mean, there are those who will argue that the physical examination, for instance, the annual physical examination, from an objective point of view, yields very little about a patient. It's very helpful other than taking their blood pressure, and feeling the lymph nodes of somebody who's not complaining about it, feeling a thyroid gland of somebody who's not complaining about it. The chances of finding anything doing those things are really very small. People have said, well, it's not worth it. But I don't think any of you would want to go to see the doctor for a physical exam that hadn't touched you in some way. So I think that there is a kind of a ritual aspect to that. Sometimes it can be very counterproductive.
a guy named Jeffrey Bishop has written about the ersatz liturgy of dying in hospitals today. And so sometimes it can be something that interferes with people's deeper understanding of the kind of human rituals that they maybe ought to be experiencing at that time, and have this sort of mechanistic substituted ritual. So it may be more complicated than just saying it's all good, but there are ritual aspects to medicine, certainly.
Let's thank.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.